You're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson, editor of the show. Earlier this year, Pew Research published the results of a study on religious diversity around the world. Well, the U.S. didn't even break the top 10 for most religiously diverse when all nations studied were taken into account. It ranked number 1 in religious diversity out of the most populous countries. The United States certainly has a Christian tilt and a sizable population of nuns. But go to any major U.S. city and you'll spot kippahs, hijabs, turbans, and houses of worship for every major belief system on the planet. Despite the American ability to live alongside people who believe vastly different things than us, the U.S. has a horrid past with religious oppression. Think of the KKK's treatment of Jewish people, or the wipeout of indigenous people and their forced conversion to Christianity, or the attacks on Muslims and Sikhs directly following 9/11. And while many prejudices take decades to extract from the mainstream, a quick study of our history reveals that there is a clear pattern of America's ability to eventually accept religious differences. Over a century ago, the Catholics pouring in from first Ireland and later Italy were near the bottom of the social hierarchy, pushed down by the majority Protestant community who had been there much longer. But today, 6 of our 9 Supreme Court justices are Catholic. Only 2 are Protestant, and 1 is Jewish. Pathways to success at the highest level are available to all in the U.S., even to those who, not very long ago, were seen as inferior. The U.S. has a long way to go in terms of equality and in the acceptance of all religions. But if history repeats itself, it seems possible that even the faiths that are most discriminated against today could also find great success here. The United States had its 250th birthday last week. And in the last few episodes, we've tried to understand the role of Christianity in America's founding. But what kinds of Christians were the first Americans? And what role did Catholics, Jews, and atheists play in the Revolution? Were there Muslims or Hindus on U.S. soil in 1776? To answer all of these questions and better understand the nature of religion at the time of America's founding, I spoke with Catherine Carté. Catherine is a history professor at Southern Methodist University and wrote the book Religion in the American Revolution, an Imperial History. Here's Catherine. Kate Carté, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate you making time for us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to ask you something very simple that I'm sure has a lot of different answers. So I want you to just take it where you want to go with it. But that is just at the time of the American Revolution, your average American, not a pastor, not a politician, farmers, merchants, tradespeople, the average American, what was the role religion played in their life? What kind of religious practices were they a part of? What were their communities like? What's the average American what's the average religion of the American in 1776?
That is a great question. And I love the way that you separated it out from clergy, right? Because a lot of the voices we get about religion and the revolution come from clergy, and those voices are incredibly important, but they're not typical. So if we think of the average American at that time, I'm going to add a couple more qualifications, and I'm going to say, we're going to say the average American who's allowed to participate in the political system, right? So this is not going to be typical of enslaved people or indigenous Americans who are, indigenous Americans are still the majority of the people on the continent. There's a substantial community of enslaved people, a high number of enslaved people, particularly in the South. Those people would have had very different experiences when it came to religion. But if you're talking about your average colonist who has a political voice, so mostly a European descended colonist, that person probably lives in a colony that has a sense of itself as part of Britain's Protestant empire. What that means is that they expect the state to promote causes that have to do with protecting Protestantism and fighting Catholicism. They also live someplace that has an established church that's funded by the colonial government. In the South and across the British Empire, that's usually the Church of England. In a few northern colonies, that's a descendant of the of the Puritan Church, what we think of as Congregationalism today. In all of those places, you would have access to public worship. That was really important to government officials, that everyone have access to public worship. But how often you went, that might really vary from place to place. You also have a lot of people in the colonies who are not a part of the established church in their colony. Germans who migrated, and it's a colony, Germans in North Carolina, there's a lot of them, but they live in a colony that has an established Anglican church. So their access to their denominational public worship is not guaranteed. They'd have to pay for it themselves. There's a chronic shortage of ministers. A lot of places, particularly as you get farther west, parishes or the size of a religious community could be geographically huge. So a lot of people, in theory, they have access to public worship, but they might go once a year, maybe not even that. And then we can come at it from the other side and say they're mostly culturally Protestant, so they'd be familiar with the Bible. The Bible might have been a text that they used to learn to read. They'd get biblical references, but I really like to keep in mind that people in the past are really not that different from people in the present. And there is no way, what we'd like to do, right? In theory, we'd like to be able to sort of chop everybody open and get a number, a readout for how religious they are. There's no way to do that. So you have the same mix of people in the past that you have in the present. You have people who are skeptical and people who are credulous, right? Who are eager to believe. You have people who have a great sense of humor. You have people who are really very, very serious, right? Think of all the personality types. Some of those people are really invested in religion because they love the potlucks, right? And some of those people are really invested in theology and they write down sermon notes, right? So we have all the same variation that we get today, you got in the past.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful to first frame it as, right, they're not a monolith, right? The American colonists are not a monolith. There's the same diversity in some sense of personality and theological beliefs that there would be today for those who are thinking through those things. I think in my own research a little bit, I've been seeing that word popping up of congregationalism. And I think that's, every now and then you'll see a church that has that word on their sign, but it's not by any means a major player in today's Christian religious landscape in the United States. I'd love for you to just tell me a little bit more about what is congregationalism, what happened to it, and yeah, what are we talking about there?
So all the denominations that we live with today, they have these names that are rooted in either theology or ecclesiology, like this organization of the church, in distinctions that were worth going to war for in the 17th century. And then often now people have no understanding of what what is a Presbyterian? Why is Presbyterianism different from Congregationalism, right? That is literally the distinction, right? So the two big categories of denominations are denominations that have bishops that usually have the word Episcopal in them, and congregations that don't. And during the English Civil War, Protestants who rejected bishops in the English-speaking countries ended up in a couple different denominations. Presbyterian denominations that were organized into regional presbyteries that would govern their church affairs, and ministers would be connected to one another, or congregationalism. In Britain, they're called independents. Here, they're called congregationalists, and they're people where the ultimate authority in the church rests in the congregation. So the congregation calls the minister. The congregation makes its ultimate choices. So the New England colonies, when we think of the Puritans and the Pilgrims and all of those folk, Connecticut, those communities, when they founded those colonies, they gave them a congregational establishment. And what that meant was that every town had to have its congregation, and that church was funded by state taxes. But the congregation governed its own religious affairs. So there wasn't a central bishop that was assigning ministers to each of those places. So because that's where congregationalism is rooted in the United States, its descendants are largely still in New England or places that New Englanders have moved. So the UCC Church is the descendant of that. And those are sort of the long genealogical descendants of Puritanism.
I think when you describe that, that really just sounds to me a lot like, non-denominational evangelicalism, that sense of, like every church is kind of deciding what's best for it. Is that similar?
Doesn't it? Yes, it does. There are a few significant differences, I think.
Okay.
What I didn't mention in all of that is the Baptists, right? So I was focusing on the differences between in church organization. Baptists also have a church organization that's congregational. But they have a different, they tend to, first of all, Baptists are all over the map in terms of, how they believe and how they organize, right? So it's almost impossible to generalize about Baptists. They tend to reject infant baptism, which is where the name comes from. Congregationalists did not reject infant baptism. Also, congregationalism in its 17th and 18th century origins, in that story I just told, was very linked to establishment. And Baptists tended not to be. Baptists tended, instead of seeing a church as a group that was drawn from a geography and ideally would include everyone in that geography and bring everyone to the right level of piety, right? Which is challenging because you get to the second and third generations. That's where things get really complicated for Congregationalists. Baptists were more likely to say, we are a gathered community of believers. And we don't have infant baptism. So each person comes in as a full communicant member. And it goes through an admissions process, basically. And there are people around us who are not a part of that system. And that's their problem, basically, right? They're not, Baptists have the strongest tradition of separation of church and state, of not wanting to work with the state. They don't want to be required to have members that didn't go through their admission process. They want that independence. So I would say the sort of modern American non-denominational pattern is more descendant from that Baptist pattern than it is from the congregational pattern, because it really is linked to this idea that the state will in no way be involved, and the church does not provide any state functions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into that because the church and state situation, because obviously the idea that churches in the United States are getting government funding is a pretty, I guess, an American heresy nowadays, where it's a radical thing. How did that happen?
But in Massachusetts, so the last places to disestablish in the United States are the New England states. So Massachusetts has a state establishment until 1833. Those congregational places kept those systems for a very long time. Connecticut was 1818. So they were the slowest to do away with that, because the Puritans had really embedded that congregationalism so deep in their sort of government DNA.
So, take me through the history of even that idea that church and state ought to be separated. When does that start? Is that an American idea? When does it start? And how do we adopt it?
It's not an exclusively American idea, and I think it has a lot of different permutations in different times and spaces, right? And as you would expect, groups that don't have the capacity to control a state are always going to have different ideas about it. So, for instance, if you look at Jewish traditions or Muslim traditions, right, you're going to see a very different set of configurations about how particularly law and religion should interact, right? So, just talking in a Protestant context, let's go post-Reformation. What happens after the wars of religion that come out of the Reformation is the idea that each state is going to have one official state church, and then each state is going to police diversity within that state. Now, in the British system, that attempt to create unity within the British state, and that state is itself a conglomerated state, right? Because we have Wales and England and Scotland sort of pushed together. The challenges, Northern and Ireland, the challenges of that situation lead in part, not entirely, but in part to the English Civil War, right? And so they develop a very kind of rich vocabulary about where the state should police uniformity and where it should allow toleration. So they have something called the 39 Articles for the Church of England, which is a list of kind of essential theological principles. And in some contexts, you have to say that you swear all of those things, that you believe all of those things. Certainly clergy do, or you have to be a member of that church to have certain state privileges. And then they work out the boundaries of dissent. So who gets to be in your community who's not a part of your state church? Well, we think of this as toleration. So who is tolerated? Catholics in that system were not tolerated. Catholic worship was illegal because Catholic worship was seen as detrimental to the state. But what they called loyal Protestant worship after the Glorious Revolution, loyal Protestant groups were allowed to exist. Their churches had to be open during public worship so the state could monitor it, and they had to register, right? But within that, they start arguing, and you see this in John Locke, they start arguing that freedom of conscience is essential, that devout people, if they're led to believe something different about a non-essential principle, and I'm going to say something like baptism is non-essential, right? Because we have Baptists and non-Baptists, people who do infant baptism and people who don't. They decide that questions of baptism are not essential to loyalty to the state. So we'll allow freedom of religion in that, right? So we have like a space where ideas about separation of church and state are being nurtured and challenged from lots of different directions. People say there should be no state in religion. People who say there should be no religion in the state for all kinds of different reasons. But they're having those discussions within this context of basically loyal Protestant deviation, right? And then they kind of expand that. And what's really revolutionary about the American Revolution is that as at the state level and at the national level, when political leaders are trying to figure out what the terms of citizenship are going to be, they see very clearly that there's no way for them to create a religiously defined citizenship because of the differences within across the colonies, that any attempt to pick a particular church or have a particular body in charge, even if you're only talking about loyal Protestants, it's not going to work. So they create essentially secular citizenship. I don't know that it's a uniquely American idea, because the French also, in a very different way, create secular citizenship. So other states also create other versions of secular citizenship, but the United States does it first. And the United States creates the idea there that you can be a member of this nation, right? And nation is a new idea at this point. You can be a member of this nation, and it doesn't matter what your religion is, right? This is how Jews get citizenship in the United States. They say, and Catholics, right? They fought in the American Revolution just like everyone else did. Their contributions warrant full membership in the state. And so they get all of the rights and privileges of citizenship because it's now secular citizenship.
Yeah, that's wild. So are you saying that? I think my question is, when you say the idea of a nation is new, what does that mean? Break that down. You're saying a nation apart from a religious affiliation?
Well, so historians love talking about this stuff, right? We love taking a term and like making it complicated.
Great.
You may have heard of the phrase, the age of democratic revolution, or the age of revolutions, right? So in the late 18th century, in the United States and in France and in Haiti and then across Latin America, groups of people form these new governments that are about membership in the state, right? So it's your attachment to a state that is derived of the people, right? So that would be the sort of new idea of a nation. There's a very important political theorist, Benedict Anderson, who calls this imagined communities. You imagine yourself to be a part of the American people, although you'll never meet all the Americans. You don't speak the same language as them. You'll never experience the borders of the United States because they're too big, but you still connect to this idea, right? So before that, people had been more likely be parts of what we would think of either as ethnic communities or of empires. And empires always bridged lots of different communities at once, right? And they were joined together at the head through the monarch or some system like that, right? But you could be, to go back to the British example, you could be English and Scottish and have the same king, right? So but you're not. When did those people become British instead of English subjects of the king and British and Scottish subjects of the king, right? So that the new idea there for us is becoming American, right? As opposed to being, Massachusetts subjects of the British king.
Yeah, and I think obviously the fact that the founding fathers could not decide on, one church to unify under says, I think, a lot about them, and I think that's plays in well to what I wanted to talk about next, which is, we've talked about the average American, the average colonist. What are the founding fathers believing? What's the diversity of beliefs up there? How is it different? How do the elites of the society shaping the society? How are they different than the common person?
Well, so one of the challenges we have is always who is a founding father, right? And one of my great professors, woman by the name of Jean Lee, always used to say, don't call them founding fathers, because the nation was not an act of birth. And what I think is really important about that phrase, that creating the nation was not an act of birth, is that, as every parent knows, when you have a child, you don't get to control the child that you give birth to, right? It's an act that creates something that is itself wholly different and new. Whereas founding the United States, the men who founded the United States, and they were mostly men, were doing so making conscious political compromises with a lot of control over what they did. So they have a lot more responsibility than parents do.
Okay, yeah.
Also, they disagreed on everything. They compromised on everything. So there is no one thing that all of the people we would call founders or framers would believe, right? So, and the people who decided to fight against Britain, the people, we're celebrating the 250th, the people who were leading the charge in 1775 are not the same people who wrote the Constitution in 1787. The people who wrote the Constitution in 1787 were remarkably young. That's actually one of the things I think is most exciting about them. They were the people who are younger than I am now, right? They're people who are on average in their 40s. Some of them much younger. James Madison is very young when he becomes the architect of the Constitution. He was too young to really have fought. He was also too sickly, but too young to have fought in the Revolution, really. So those were people who did not have deep experience being British subjects. They weren't old men, with the exception of Benjamin Franklin, right? They weren't old men. So their experiences at these different moments are shaped by really different things. Now, all that being said, they were overwhelmingly part of the dominant denominations wherever they lived. And they generally assumed that religious institutions were an important part of public life. They generally assumed that Protestantism would continue to be the dominant religion of the United States, whether they cared about that or not. And the other thing is that, with the exception of a really tiny number of people who most of your audience will not have heard of, most of them did not think about religion very much, and most of them didn't write about it very much. Jefferson's kind of an outlier in this because he really gets into it, especially in his later life. But, Washington kept whatever his beliefs were, he kept them very private. He thought religion was something that the clergy or the church was assigned to take care of in public. He was not a clergyman, and his faith was private. So he didn't really talk about it. We have no idea what his level of piety was. The idea that he prayed at Valley Forge, that was made up later. He may have prayed at Valley Forge. He did not publicly do something. And what George Washington, in the dark of the night when he was scared, how he framed his hopes for support, I have no idea. Right. He did not tell us.
And so would they have been, I don't know. Is there sort of a sharp divide then between the average person and the elites, or is it really just we don't know? It's all kind of blurry, and we're not really sure. Whatever the levels of piety are always a little bit confusing.
Levels of piety are always confusing. I would say that the biggest difference between the elite and the average person is going to be the vocabulary that they're going to use to describe these things. So when we talk about something like the Enlightenment, which is a really important intellectual movement, that's really where we're developing some of the languages of separation of church and state and sort of theories of government and all of that. The people who have access to that language are people who are educated. Now, that doesn't mean that people who were less educated believed more or less, right? John Adams, he was certainly a person who was educated in Enlightenment thought. He was a Unitarian, so he was a Protestant who did not believe in the Trinity. He believed that Jesus was a man, and that there was a unitary God. But he was absolutely coming out of that Protestant Puritan tradition. He's very much a descendant of Puritans, and he's what we might call heterodox in his theology of Jesus, right? That's not typical of Protestants at that day. Protestants at that time typically believe in the Trinity. But he cared a lot about the importance of religion and piety. It's a heterodox religion, but he cared a lot about making sure that people have access to things like public worship. So we can't necessarily assume that because someone's into the Enlightenment that they're not very religious, right? Or that they're, it's just a lot more mixed up than that. But I think I'll stop there.
No, yeah, it's fine. And I think the other thing that was interesting to me is you saying that probably most of the founding fathers actually didn't think that much about religion, not nearly as much as we talk about them as they do. I feel like in the American mind, in sort of the legend of the founding, there is a kind of this understanding that religious freedom is a fundamental, a core pillar of what makes America. To what extent is that true, and to what extent is that myth that's kind of come later when we start developing the relationship between church and state?
So that's a great question. So the British also were deeply invested in the idea that the British Constitution essentially protected religious freedom. The notion of religious freedom that they have derives from their history, right? From their experience, from their categories of loyal Protestantism and all of that. They believe that Americans in particular, and they're thinking of Puritans in this, are fanatics, right? They think of the Salem witch trials. They'll reference the Salem witch trials and they'll say the Americans are fanatics. They don't believe in religious liberty. They persecute people. Whereas in Britain, where you have this nice traditional Church of England, that system protects the freedom of religious dissenters and religious minorities, right? So both sides say they're fighting for religious freedom. So when we're thinking about the fight between the British and the Americans, neither of them fights for religious freedom because they're using the same language and they both believe in it. So they fight over sovereignty. They fight over other, tax policy is part of it, but it's really over issues of authority, right? So they're fighting over something else. After the fighting against the British is done, the Americans, or even as it's going on, the Americans start investing in the idea that God is providentially on their side. Interestingly, they start talking more in terms of biblical history as opposed to Protestant history. So instead of representing the fight against Catholics, because of course they're fighting with the French Catholics, right? They're going to reach to biblical metaphor and kind of replace some of the metaphors that the British had been using. So they're going to say the United States is providentially, blessed. And then they're going to really build in the idea that religious freedom was an essential part of the ideas of 1776. In fact, I'm a scholar by the name of Alyssa Pennick recently wrote an article about how it's actually that religious minorities, and she's looking at Maryland and Virginia, religious minorities at the time of the Constitution writing felt that the they had not been adequately protected. And so they actually start making the argument that they were promised religious freedom in 1776, even though it hadn't really been part of the conversation in 1776. They bring it in, right? I mean, it's there. It kind of floats around. It's not that it's irrelevant in 75 and 76, but it's not the centerpiece of what they're fighting over. They're fighting over their rights as Englishmen. They're fighting over, that's the language they're using. But by the 1780s, people are saying, we fought for religious freedom. And that's something that Americans still axiomatically believe, that the revolution was fought for religious freedom. It's not factually accurate. The British were not a threat to American religious freedom in any kind of meaningful way. None of the serious crises that lead to, like, if you look at the chain of events, none of those crises are centrally religious or framed in religious terms. It's not a religious war. But Americans give it that cast very, very quickly.
Yeah, I definitely think the story that you're told in history class in elementary school, what I remember is very much it being about the pilgrims. They didn't want to worship in, I guess, the Anglican Church. They didn't want to be a part of the King's Church, and they wanted to have their own independent religion, and that's fundamentally the reason that they left. And to what extent is that also a part of this misunderstanding? Is that also kind of an overinflated and oversimplified sense of what happened? Or is it that, after, 100 years, things had kind of changed a little bit, the priorities had changed?
So think about the way we tell historical stories, right? And what you just said is exactly what I hear from students and from everybody all the time, right? The Puritans left England for religious freedom, and then we have the American Revolution. And some of my students will even have the Puritans fled George III, and then they fought the revolution, right? So the Puritans left before the English Civil War. They left but it's largely 1620 to 1630 is that migration, right? And then enormous things change in religious and political law across the British Empire over the next 150 years, right? So they were as far from those migrations as we are from the origins of the Civil War, right? So I would not go to war today over something that the people who fought the Civil War, that specific thing wouldn't do it anymore, right? I'm not saying slavery isn't important. It's a dangerous metaphor there, right? The values, maybe it's a really good metaphor because the values can carry over, right? But the causes would be totally different, right? You would need a present reason to go to war again, right? So the reasons that they're fighting in the 1770s are totally different and have nothing to do with those earlier migrations. There is just no straight line. The number of people who migrate in the Great Migration of the Puritans is tiny compared to the number of people who you have in the colonies 150 years later, right? It's just a completely different situation. But that story is so powerful. So sometimes historians talk about it as a double founding, right? We pull together this narrative of the founding of Massachusetts and the founding of Massachusetts and the American Revolution into one story. Allied all the time that's between them. And if you think about our calendar, right, we do it because we do Thanksgiving and the 4th of July, right? We have basically two commemorative events like that are about specific dates, right? And so we tell children, these are the two things you need to connect, right? It's not good historical methodology to connect them. It's very good national mythology, or it's been very effective national mythology.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I really appreciate you walking through all that. I also want to talk about on a slightly different path, but we've touched on it. The idea that even though it's not a religious war, you are having a really, really prominent Protestant empire fighting another very up and coming a Protestant nation that was the United States. And throughout history, I feel like the idea of Protestant on Protestant warfare was far less common than Protestant on Catholic warfare, being probably the largest, and then obviously, Christian on Muslim warfare, Jewish Muslim. The idea of Protestant on Protestant is how rare is that? How unique to the Revolutionary War is that? Is that just me having a blind spot in history? What were some of the nuances and differences of having a war that was fought by Protestants against each other?
That's a great question. So it's really going to pivot on what you call a war, right?
Okay.
I will say there's a very easy way to say that the American Revolution is the first major war that's fought between Protestant powers, not coded in religious language. So there had been earlier wars between Protestant powers, particularly the Anglo-Dutch wars, but they tended to use religious language to get those wars, to make those wars happen. The other thing that's really important is that when we talked about sort of the birth of a nation, right? The idea of a nation, that the Age of Revolutions is the pivot point where we get that secular citizenship and the idea of a secular nation. So it is kind of the first like that, but it's really not the last, right? So we start with that. We develop this idea that nations don't represent or shouldn't represent a religion, right? And then in the centuries that have followed, I mean, obviously World Wars I and II were fought between, the United States and Germany are both largely Protestant nations, and neither of those wars were fought specifically in religious terms, right? As if we were fighting against the wrong kind of Protestants, that we were fighting the Germans because they were the wrong kinds of Protestants, right? We're fighting over different ideas in those wars, or over different practices. By the same token, you remember when George W. Bush responded to 9/11, he was very clear that the war on terror was not going to be a war on Islam, right? We've seen some slippage in that language in the current administration, but in previous administrations, we have very much stressed that, right? That's partly American investment in an idea of the nation being secular, right? But not every nation around the world works the same way. And right, if you look at a nation like Iran, traditionally before 1979, historians had tended to think of revolutions as things that were modernizing and anti-religious. And then after the Iranian Revolution, it becomes clear that a nation can actually run that in a totally different way, right? I don't want to say it's going backwards because there's not a beginning and an end here, but that the Iranians had a revolution that was essentially religious and a change in how they understood their nation that went towards more religion, right? So I think the thing that I think is interesting to do is to kind of keep track of when are we fighting over religion or about religion? What does it mean? I mean, this has been very much in the news lately, right? What does it mean when political leaders use religious language, or when they speak on behalf of the United States and say the United States represents a particular religious value? Right? In the Cold War, we absolutely said we stood for religion against the godless communists, but we worked very hard to make sure that was Judeo-Christianity, right? It was going to be tri-faith religion. It wasn't one religion. So the ways that language works is what's really interesting.
Yeah, I think I'm also interested in sort of the reality that even though the U.S. is founded on this really secular grounds, and as you're saying, the first to do the citizenship that was not based on being a member of the church or whatever, and you look at today, and so many nations across Europe, in particular, have a national church, a state religion, and if you look at the demographics on actual practitioners of the religion, they're very few and far between. Whereas the United States today, religion is very alive and well. People are deeply zealous. What do you make of that? How did that happen?
I think historians and sociologists have come to kind of two different explanations for that. And I think there's a lot to be had in each of those explanations. So I'm not going to go with either side. One of them is the idea that because Americans because of the way that the United States has diverse religious traditions, and because you get a separation of church and state in the United States really early, Americans get voluntarily involved. And so our society is built, de Tocqueville talks about this, right? Our society is built on this kind of voluntarism, and religion is a part of that. Our churches, our ministers have to figure out, are they going to charge for pew rentals? Are they going to pass the plate? Are they going to do dues of some kind? Are they going to mandatory membership with tithes, right? They have to work those things out because the state's not going to do it for them. That creates a level of voluntarism and individual investment, sort of literally and figuratively, that leads to this sort of vibrant marketplace of religions. And so that's one reason why we have a lot more religion, and that in Europe, where they tended to have state churches, it's there for you whenever you want it. The state's in charge of it. You pay for it in your taxes. You don't have to really care, right? So Europeans maybe didn't ever take responsibility. That's one explanation. The other explanation is that after World War II, the refounding of the state, and I think a lot of European nations think of themselves as having been really refounded after World War II. And I think that actually even includes Great Britain, right? That the state transforms dramatically after World War II in what it promises its citizens. National health care, broad-based education of high quality. Some of those were responsibilities that previously had been a part of the church. And clergy in Europe, by and large, supported those moves and wanted that. So the theory would be clergy were more invested in the health and well-being of the citizens of their nation than they were in territorially guarding their right to dole out those services. Right. So instead of the church needing to control education, they're happy for the state to take over all of that. Instead of the church being integral to healthcare practices, the state is taking over more of that. Because of that settlement, many of the functions that Americans after World War II are still going to their churches for, and we think about, George H.W. Bush, right, the 1,000 Points of Light, the idea that we expect some social welfare functions in the United States to come voluntarily from our faith communities, that should be an essential part of how we dole out services in the United States. We didn't go through that process. We did not refound the state after World War II with the understanding that the national state is centrally responsible for the health and well-being of individuals. Our national state does not have the standards European states do for that. And so that would be another reason why churches are more healthy in the United States, right? Depending on, there's a really complicated history to all of these things, but I think those would be the two ideas.
Totally. Yeah, no, I know these are all things that are often debated and written about, and
yes. And I'm an early Americanist, not a 20th century person. So, I'm kind of cringing. My 20th century colleagues are going to say, you got all that wrong.
No worry. No, I appreciate it. I'll go back to your comfortable time period then, because I have more questions. Going back to the revolution, I am really interested in sort of, you talk about how there's the Congregationalists who are, state funded by, I'm guessing just, the Puritan communities. But then you also have churches that are still being funded by Church of England, which I don't know if they're called Episcopalians yet, but eventually become the Episcopalians. What are the convictions of most of those church members in the churches of England that have been, planted in the United States? Do they tend to be more loyalist? Did they tend to sort of separate their church and state and side with the Americans? What was sort of the path towards making your decision when it came to who you were going to support during the Revolutionary War, if you were going to an Anglican church in the U.S. at the time?
So there's really three answers to that, because the Church of England is so big. Right. In the South, there are two answers. To one of the answers is the North, two of them are the South. In the South, there are a lot of Anglicans who are committed to the Anglican Church, and yet are often quite committed to the revolutionary cause, and they're kind of left a little bit high and dry after the war, and they're going to be the core of the kind of reorganized Episcopalian Church. The other Southern answer is that we don't really have Methodists in the United States before the Revolution. So John Wesley had a very small presence there, but we have a lot of revivalism going on, sort of some of it's within Presbyterian groups, some of it's within Baptist groups, but a lot of those people are kind of in Anglican communities in the South. After the war, when the Church of England falls apart, John Wesley chooses to ordain clergy kind of through his own special, his own authority. Basically, he takes on that authority and ordains or starts ordaining ministers and then bishops. And so the Methodist Church is also going to grow up out of that that old Church of England. Right. So those people were also probably disproportionately pro-revolution, right? But they're going to be making those choices not really based on religion. In both of those communities, they're making their they're making their choices to support the revolution or not support the revolution based on their politics. And then they're going to end up in those communities afterwards. In the Episcopalian and then the Methodist churches afterwards. In the North is where we see the strongest Anglican loyalism. And that's really because in the North, Anglicans were not the established church. And so that's where you have people who, in particularly New England, but also in the middle colonies in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, in those places where they were, they're kind of religious outsiders. And so they have this sense of political separateness from their neighbors already, and they were disproportionately loyalists. And there's a huge loyalist exodus after the war. So especially of clergy, but also of Anglican clergy had sworn ordination oaths to the king, right? So violating those oaths was a really big deal for them, often a spiritual matter. So there's a big exodus of clergy. And there's also a big exodus of Anglican laity in the North, they're disproportionately loyalists. And the United States becomes an uncomfortable place. We forget how much straight up bullying and violence there was about policing the patriot cause, but there was a lot. And in the North, the people who suffered from that were often Anglicans, and they often left.
I also want to get into, and we'll be almost done here because I don't want to take too much of your time. But I want to get into what you mentioned earlier, that these largely Christian American colonists are fighting alongside Jewish people and also Catholics, but still, which I guess they may not have considered as peers at the time. But where are the Jewish people coming from? What's sort of their contribution to the American Revolution? Are they often more Jewish in heritage but not practicing, or are there also plenty of religious Jews who are fighting in the revolution?
Well, so plenty of is so when you're talking about the Jewish community, you're talking about, I think it's 1/10 of 1% of the American population at the time. So we're talking about a very small number of people. There were more Catholics than there were Jews. Although interestingly, Catholics, there are more like laws that target Catholics because there's more Catholics and more Catholics in Europe and all of that. Jews are usually either allowed or not, right? And then they can kind of the laws are a little bit less directed at them. But you have Jewish communities in all of the major East Coast cities, especially Charleston, Savannah, New York. During the war, the Jewish community divides, just like every other community divides, but they serve a little bit disproportionate to their numbers. So slightly more of them end up on the Patriot side. Some of the biggest example of religious violence during the war, actually, against Jews, is in St. Eustatius. When so the St. Eustatius is a colony that is supporting a lot of smuggling, and it's got like a free status. I think it was a Dutch colony, Dutch or Danish. I forget the details. But anyway, St. Eustatius is where the pirates and the smugglers are getting weapons into the colonies from, and the British attack. And there's a Jewish community there, a substantial Jewish community, and the British admiral, I think Romney is his name, decides that he just tortures and torments and humiliates and just awful stuff to them, to really targets them, saying that they are not loyal Britons, right? So they come out for special punishment there. That probably pushes even more into the patriot camp in the mainland colonies that are rebelling. But they divide, and many of the patriot Jews end up in Philadelphia and go through an experience of being kind of all together in the temple there. I think it's Mikveh Israel is the temple there, and or the synagogue, and they kind of share political ideas there, and then they go back out across all of the colonies. And so American Judaism gets this very distinctive pro-revolution character because of this sort of shared experience during the war. But there's what's called a Jewish regiment in South Carolina because it had such a high number of Jewish participants, and Washington was always very clear that he did not care about the religion of his recruits. He took Catholics, he took Jews, he took everybody. He did not care. He had opinions about their race, but he did not have opinions about their religion if they could serve.
Yeah, and on the note of religious minorities, this is, I think, a long shot question, but I am curious, to what extent was there any kind of Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist presence in the 1700s in North America? I mean, I know there may have been in some of the enslaved communities, and I'm not sure, but just what is there any sort of presence there?
Well, so there's always the question of, is there the presence there, or is there like the acknowledged presence of? So yes, there were certainly people who had grown up Muslim, who were practicing Muslims, who were enslaved in the South. Their enslavers would not have acknowledged that or given them any rights based on that. And so It's the fact that it's there does not necessarily mean it shows up in the kind of way those people were not able, because of their race, to claim citizenship in the way that Jews did, right? Because Washington said you can serve regardless of religion, but he didn't say that because of race, right? So then they're able to make those arguments. So that's one piece of it. The other thing I think that's really interesting is that Americans certainly know that there are Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists in the world. Hindus in particular serve as like a metaphor for the exotic. Muslims usually serve as a metaphor for infidels, or for those communities work in metaphorical ways in conversations. So you see, in arguments or discussions about separation of church and state, for instance, about removing religious tests for office, who gets to hold office, right? So a lot of states retain religious tests for office, even when they've disestablished their churches. So you still have to subscribe something that says, I believe in both books of the Bible, or I believe in a future state of rewards and punishments if you're going to hold office at the state level, not the federal level, but the state level. Well, so when they're debating those, they say, could we really have a Hindu as a senator, right? Is that even thinkable, right? And those discussions about the exotic and what are the boundaries, who gets religious freedom, those go on for a long, long time. So it's in the early 20th century, there are these intense Senate hearings about whether Reed Smoot, who's the first Mormon elected to the Senate, whether he can be a senator purely because he is also a Mormon, right? Can a Mormon represent Utah in the Senate, or is the fact of being a Mormon so disqualifying, right? So, in the Revolutionary era, those groups that we think of, that we now think of as fully qualified for secular citizenship, right? And we have lots of Muslim neighbors, lots of Hindu neighbors, lots of Buddhist neighbors, and lots of nothing neighbors, right? In those days, those communities function mostly, I think, as a metaphor. but not Jews and Catholics. Jews and Catholics were the groups that were present and talked about. And then African Americans and Indigenous Americans were the groups that we can say had different religious traditions and different practices, but they weren't being talked about because they were excluded on racial grounds, and they weren't a part of the religious conversation.
Well, this has all been super fascinating, and I think I'll end with a question that's more whatever you make of it. But obviously, you've given it seems like the majority of your professional life to the study of religion at the time of the American Revolution, and I'm sure you're coming up with new interesting things that you hadn't seen before all the time. So I'm just curious, in your current research projects, what are you really interested in right now? What's sort of surprising you? What would be fun for our listeners to know about?
So I'm really, really interested in what happens to religion during the war. So I'm looking at a community in Savannah, Georgia, an orphanage that had been founded by the evangelist George Whitefield and then is inherited by an English countess, and she runs it during the war. And how can we as historians even find religion when the institutions have completely collapsed? And that institutional collapse happened all across the colony. So I'm looking at it in one particular place, but I'm interested in what that means for people. On one level, it's a loss of pastoral care, right? If your clergy have left, or your churches are gone, you've lost your meeting places. So there's that sense of loss and catastrophe. Do people talk about it? Or are they just so distracted by, these people are also literally at starvation levels of food, right? So does religion become sort of ancillary? I'll talk about baptizing this baby once I get this baby healthy enough to get to its second year or whatever. But first we have to make sure we have enough potatoes. So I'm interested in those it's almost a question of how you research it, that rather than a question of what happened, right? How do I follow religion in these moments of real social breakdown?
Cool. Well, Kate Carté, thank you so much for being on the show. Really enjoyed talking to you, and so interesting to learn more about the revolution.
Thank you so much. This has been a lovely conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. If you'd like to hear more from Catherine, you can find her book, Religion and the American Revolution, at the link in the description. If you like the podcast, please consider rating and reviewing us on your podcast platform, subscribing to Religion Unplugged on YouTube, and sharing our work with friends or on social media. Religion Unplugged's reporting and analysis is brought to you by real people like me, not AI. If you appreciate the work we do here at Religion Unplugged and want to keep this show ad-free, please consider making a donation. Now is a particularly good time to give, since from now through August 17th, your gifts will be doubled. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode of the Religion Unplugged podcast.